the visits that formed while he fled. These are series of visits that God uses to form David while he flees for his life from 2 Samuel chapter 15, 32 through 16, 14. A couple different ways to break up this passage, but this is largely considered a pretty good section to get through. Let's remember just the book in general. What is the main point of 1st and 2nd Samuel? What are we looking for in 1st and 2nd Samuel? Or who are we looking for when the original readers were reading it? The king. Okay, say it with me. The king of Israel. Okay, who are we supposed to be looking for when we read 1st and 2nd Samuel? Great. Okay, you guys got to get this in your head, okay? Because this is really big. This is the whole thing. We've talked about this, how the first part of 1st Samuel, is all leading up to saying who's going to be the king? Who's going to be the king? David is going to be the king. And then David suffers over and over and over again as he goes through trial to make him to be the king he needs to be. He becomes the king. Things are going great. And then, we see he is not the king we need as he sins greatly. And this whole section we're in is the punishment, the judgment, or the consequences for his sin, right? As we're left going, oh man, we know it's going to be a son of David, but obviously David is not good enough to be the king because he abuses his own people and he experiences the consequences of it, of his sin with Bathsheba and Uriah specifically. But then things got a little bit better for David, okay? He had his palace, he had the ark in Jerusalem. Things are pretty good. He had victory over all his enemies, no more battles, many wives, many children, and even his estranged son, Absalom, is back. He's even trying to offer sacrifices to Yahweh. It looks pretty good. And then he says, I'm going to go to Hebron. And he headed down south to the city of Hebron, saying, I'm going to offer sacrifices. But what was Absalom really up to there? He was trying to crown himself king. Exactly. So he gathers all the armies of Israel. When it says the men of Israel, that means all the armies of Israel joined him, and they marched right back up towards Jerusalem. And we saw in chapter 15, verse 13, that a messenger beats them to David and warns David of the bad news. This army is approaching. So David gathered his family, he gathered his staff, and he takes off, perhaps trying to avoid battle in the holy city, especially between him and his son. And we talked about how he had 3 visits that reminded him of God's grace along the way. Here he is in utter desperation. His son is turned against him. The nation is turned against him. And he is going to, sorry, one second here. He is going to be visited to remind him about how God is still with him. We saw his servants all came up. His servants still wanted to support him. This group of Gentiles, there's a group of Gentile warriors who are with him that even though Israel is turned against him and no longer sees him as the king, that the Gentiles see him as the king and want to support him, which is pretty amazing. Encouraging the Gentiles are turning towards Yahweh because of him. And then not just the Gentiles, but the priests and the Levites, the religious class wants to support him. So much so, they bring him the symbol of God's blessing, the Ark of the Covenant. But why did David refuse the Ark of the Covenant? What is it? Yeah, it's if he remembers his history, he remembers the fact that in the beginning of Samuel, he wrote about a time period where the people tried to use God's ark as a weapon, and that turned out against them. Does God need the ark to bring David victory? No. And he just said, he's like, I need God more than I need the ark. If God wants to bring me back to the ark, he can. If God rejects me, he can. God's in control. I'm not going to use this as a talisman because they had tried to do that in the past. But on his way out, David got perhaps what was the most worse, depressing, devastating news. Remember, as he goes up in verse 30 onto the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, there he is told Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, "O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Here we're going to see this story today kind of continues. The true story of David's exile right now brings lessons of encouragement, testing, and attack so that we might learn to trust God in our trials. So often we keep talking about this, it seems like David's trials disappear and then they're back again. And so it is with us. How do we trust God when a trial comes again? And the answer is learning from the examples of our forefathers. Let's look at how God was using the trials in David's life to teach him, just as he is using ours. The first one comes off verses 32 through 37, that David, the final visit from a friend, shows him grace. God is teaching him grace once more, that God is with him. And it started in verse 31 with David praying. You remember, here is David's going up the hill, heading off up the hill, away from the city of Jerusalem, up towards the Mount of Olives, following that little black line. And as he's going up, he's weeping. It says, verse 32, while David was coming to the summit where God was worshipped. It's the place where people used to worship God. And in 1 Kings 11, we found out one day Solomon puts up an idol over on that same mountain. Very sad. But this is a place that God was worshipped at one point. And you can almost imagine Solomon as a little boy walking with his mother up the mountain. And they're in desperation again. The whole royal family is destitute, crying. And we talked about last week how this finally brought David back to praying. He says, Lord, please, you have to stop this advice. There's no one who can stop his wisdom. And right at that moment, Hushai, the Archite, walks up. Hushai, the Archite. He is one of David's friends. In fact, in 1 Chronicles 27:33, he is called the friend of David, the king's friend. Pretty big friend, important. And even though this is clearly the answer to prayer, we find that David, with him, makes a plan. So he prayed and then he planned. Verse 33, David said to him, if you go on with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in times past, so now I will be your servant. Then you will defeat me for me the counsel of Ahithophel. Are not Zadok and Abiathar the priests with you there? So whatever you hear from the king's house, tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Behold, their 2 sons are with them there, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send to me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city just as Absalom was entering Jerusalem. So David explains to Hushai, saying, you know what? If you come with me, that's one more mouth to feed. That's another person to protect. Chances are, if he is considered a very wise man in Israel, he's old and not of fighting age, but he is of advising age. So David has a different idea of how he could help. What does David say he should do? What's the way he can help? Inform, right? What's his new job title? Spy, right? So he has this great team here. So you got to think, he has a problem, okay? So here is everybody in this situation, right? And you have problem of here of the wisdom of Ahithophel. He has to stop Absalom. Get these names right. So many names. Stop Absalom from listening to this wisdom. How does he do that? But sending the wisdom of someone else. Okay? So Hushai is going to be the wisdom to fight against Ahithophel's wisdom. And since Hushai has been in government for a long time, he'd likely be treated with respect because he knows the bureaucracy. He knows how to get things done. He's been very helpful in the past. So he can take something very important that the priests cannot do, because the priests are over at the tabernacle. Hushai would be in the king's palace. He would be directly where the decisions are being made day after day, and he could take that knowledge, pass it on to the sons of the priests, who will then take it to David. David has just created a little spy network, so he can know what is going on, and he can fight against and plant wisdom against what would defeat him, which becomes very important in a few moments. So notice this, though. David doesn't say, oh, no, I've prayed, so now I just have to leave this to God. This is in God's hands, right? Nor does God just, when David prays, stop his wisdom. God doesn't just kill Ahithophel on the spot or make him stupid in a miracle. In fact, this is what, is the most normal of all things. How do you make someone not listen? By giving them another voice to listen to. It's very natural, very normal. But this is what theologians and Bible students call the providence of God. There are miracles of God where God miraculously changes things, and then there's providence where God has set up the perfect plan since before the foundation of the world, and we just step into it. Hushai then makes a mile walk back to Jerusalem. And what does he find in verse 37 when he enters the city? Absalom is at the city gates, entering as well, which means David is still up here a mile away. This is incredibly close, right? David has just barely made it out of Jerusalem with his family and his servants before Absalom and his army marched into the city. See, only God could have orchestrated this. The perfect timing that gets David out and sends a spy network back in so that they're not even caught. Yeah, it could have just happened by accident, but this is so often, we hear stories again and again. You can think of other examples, but I love hearing the recent ones of different families who get married. A couple tries to have kids and cannot. They go to the doctors and they do all kinds of treatment, and they're told, you are never going to have kids. This is just impossible. And nothing works until finally they pray, and then pregnancy after pregnancy, they have child after child. Each one is supposed to be a miracle that could have never happened. Was this just chance? No. It's God's providence, and he worked inside them to allow them to have children. So, point being, we must see that in the Bible, prayer and planning go together perfectly, right? Prayer and planning are not enemies, they are friends. There's nothing holy in saying, well, I've prayed about it, I just need to let go and let God, right? So if I'm single and I've prayed for a wife, well, now God just has to make it happen and bring her along. Or if I'm sick and, I can't go to a doctor because that would be expressing lack in faith because I asked God to heal me. Or I'm struggling with my anger. I prayed for God to take it away from me. So that's all I can do is just pray instead of going and doing what he commands, of asking other people to bear our burdens for us, of taking scripture and applying it to our hearts. You see, our actions are the means God uses to answer prayer. A similar action was done by Nehemiah. Remember Nehemiah? This great story. Nehemiah comes back to rebuild Jerusalem. It's torn down, and he's threatened by Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs. And they want to come in and they destroy the Jerusalem that's being rebuilt because they do not want the city to stand, to have its own authority. And so Nehemiah 4, verse 9 says, "We prayed to our God, and we set a guard as protection against them day and night." Nehemiah 4:9. They got on their knees in prayer and they hands on their swords. The connection, like they got on their knees to ask God, but also put their hands on their swords because their actions, they knew, would be part of what God used to fulfill their prayers. Problem is, David doesn't always, he isn't always a prayerful man. And sometimes he doesn't always make wise decisions then. Because once this is done, we see another visit that comes to him, has a manipulative visit that teaches David to have discernment. Chapter 16, 2 Samuel, verses 1 through 4, David's manipulative visit that taught him to have discernment. When David had passed a little beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of donkeys saddled, bearing 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 of summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and the summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who faint in the wilderness to drink." And the king said, "And where is your master's son?" Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father.'" Then the king said to Ziba, "Behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." And Ziba said, "I pay homage. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my lord, the king." David's on the run, and as he's going, first off, assistance appears. And it seems perfect, right? This is a great situation. David has basically just gotten a little bit further past the summit. So here he is, and then just made just past Jerusalem. He's on the other side of the mountain, and Ziba shows up. Now, I don't expect you to remember Ziba, but Ziba is the servant of Saul. So he's part of Saul's family, but he's not a son of Saul, so that's why there's a little gray line there. And he was the one who was given all of Saul's property after Saul and his son Ishbosheth died. He's caring for it as the chief servant. If you recall, David wanted to take care of one of Jonathan's sons because he made a promise to care for Jonathan's sons no matter what happened. And so he asks Ziba, "Hey, is there any child of Saul or Jonathan left?" And Ziba goes, "Yes, in fact, there is. Mephibosheth, but he's crippled and he's alive though." And so David brings Mephibosheth back to him and puts him in charge of all of the land of Saul again and gives him a royal seat at the table, treated like a prince of Israel, like one of his own sons. Now, Ziba shows up and he has donkeys that would provide rest for the royal family. And he has food and he has a wine in a wineskin like this, all wrapped up to give nourishment to the troops. Here they are in this painful wilderness. It is dry. It is weary. They had to rush with their lives. These are amazing gifts being brought to them. And you know what they say about looking a gift horse in the mouth, right? But David has his doubts. And he's being betrayed right now by his own son. You might wonder why he would respond to a son of or a servant of Saul's family the same way. And so he begins to ask some questions in verse 2. The king said to Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, and the bread and summer fruit are for the young men to eat, and the wine are those who faint in the wilderness to drink. Notice Ziba kind of dodges the reason of like why he brought them and instead focuses on how they will benefit David. So he doesn't really have to answer what's going on. He's just like, I'm just here to help you, king. Here you go. David goes, okay, but he notices something. Verse 3, saying, where is your master's son? Now, notice back in verse 1. Who is Ziba's master in verse 1? It's Ziba, the servant of who? Mephibosheth, right? Now, who is David saying is Ziba's master in verse 3? His father. So Jonathan or maybe Saul. It's interesting that David does it because the narrator is saying Ziba is Mephibosheth's servant. David is saying, no, Mephibosheth is just the son of your servant. It's like David's upset. There's something wrong here. So he's using an indirect way to kind of say, where is he? The one I've been taking care of. And Ziba straight up lies. He says, oh, he wants his throne again. He thinks that he is going to get the throne of his grandfather Saul now that there's fighting. And so Judah might go with Absalom, and here Mephibosheth is going to get the other 10 tribes of Israel. And there's got to be some tension there. There probably are some people who want the divided kingdom under the throne and family of Saul anymore. Because what happens to the kingdom after Solomon dies? Does it stay united? No, it splits. So hold your finger here and go to chapter 19, verse 26 and 27. Spoiler warning, David wins, okay? And then he returns, and he comes to Mephibosheth, and he goes, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? And in verse 26, chapter 19, he answered, my lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I might ride on it and go with the king. For your servant is lame. He had slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. So he himself said he saddled a donkey so that he might join David in his flight from Absalom. But his servant Ziba betrayed him and then bashed him before David. And it really would have been crazy. Like if Ziba's telling the truth, Mephibosheth would have to be crazy to think that he could be king in a situation like this. There's no way Absalom would give up his throne. And then look in chapter 19, verse 17 through 18. Notice who meets the king because he wasn't with him in battle. Verse 17 says, with him were 1,000 men from Benjamin, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and 20 servants, rushed down to the Jordan before the king, and they crossed the ford to bring over the king's household and to do his pleasure. Who stayed in Jerusalem and didn't go into battle with the king? Who's the man with his 15 sons? Ziba. So did Ziba go into battle and follow David out into exile? No, he stayed. So think of it this way. Ziba probably had a pretty good hunch. David's been an amazing general for years. He's probably going to win this. How do I have favor with him so that when he returns, I can still be on the good side, but also not antagonize the current king, Absalom? No problem. All right, I bring him some supplies and then I leave and I go back to my nice home and I keep working the gardens. Ziba is a manipulator. You see that? He's manipulating David, painting this rosy picture of how he's this great servant and Mephibosheth is this wicked, vile opportunist who's trying to take back his throne. Now, David doesn't stop to pray. He doesn't stop to think or listen, but instead, he jumps to judgment. David jumps to a judgment. Verse 4. Then the king said to Ziba, "Behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." And Ziba said, "I pay homage. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my lord, the king." David gave all of Mephibosheth's property to Ziba. David then, in chapter 19, splits the property between Mephibosheth and Ziba. And in verse 30, listen to how Mephibosheth responds. 19, verse 30. Mephibosheth said to the king, "Oh, let him take all of it, since my lord the king has come home safely." Do you believe Mephibosheth? Do you think he's honest and he'd rather have the king than all his property? Maybe, yeah. To be inside his house. Ziba right now is pretending to be honored and thanking him. But this whole thing is actually pulling the shroud over David's eyes. He doesn't use wisdom here. But the fact is, it's just a little bit believable enough, right? Sadly, people are getting caught right now in fake news and satire stories. A study was done recently that showed a large percentage of what is fake news that is spreading isn't even coming from websites and articles and newspapers that are intentionally trying to deceive. Actually, a large percent of it is coming from satirical sites like The Onion or the Babylon Bee that people believe. And if you guys remember, some of you watched late night show will remember the Colbert Report from a few years ago by comedian Stephen Colbert. And in that, he played a mock show of trying to pretend to be a conservative cable news pundit. And he would actually make fun of conservatives all throughout. But regularly, they found that conservatives actually thought he was expressing support for their opinions. Because even though he was mocking them, he mocked them in such a way that made them go, "Oh, I believe that." You know, the Babylon Bee, for example, is a Christian news site that makes news stories. And they had a story a few years ago saying that Cory Booker, the senator, was saying the Second Amendment was a loophole. And it was believed in a survey by 19% of Republicans and only 8% of Democrats. Why did they believe it? Because they're like, to the Republicans, they're like, you know, that makes sense. I believe that Cory Booker would say something like that. While the presupposition of the Democrats was, oh, that would never be said. Point being, there needs to be wisdom when we hear a story, whether we believe the story, right? When you hear a story, do we believe the story? Oh, I don't want to go there yet. David does not act by wisdom. If you get nothing else tonight, get Proverbs 18:17 down. Proverbs 18:17 is so key for our wisdom because it says, "The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him." Right? Why did someone else coming make the first person not seem so right? Because they disagree. Because there are two sides to every story. Because it seems so crystal clear until you're like, oh, wait, maybe there's another part of it. Now, as Christians, we are called to have charitable judgments. Yeah, Mindy. 18:17. It's Proverbs chapter 18, verse 17. 18:17. Thanks, Mindy, for getting that. So in Matthew 7, verse 12, Jesus gives us the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, for thus sums up the law and the prophets. So really easy, picture yourself in Mephibosheth's situation, or in any time you have been misunderstood or misrepresented. And then think how you would like the other people to treat you in that situation, how you would like them to give you the benefit of the doubt, how you would like them to kind of consider maybe a better interpretation of your actions, and then go and do that to others. If you were to imagine, what could David have thought more charitably of Mephibosheth? Instead of assuming instantly Ziba's 100% correct and Mephibosheth is trying to steal the throne, what was a more charitable or loving thing that David could have guessed about Mephibosheth? What was wrong with Mephibosheth's feet? He's crippled. Yeah. Do crippled people go into battle very well? No. I don't think again, what would be something? Maybe there's a big miscommunication. Whatever it is, discernment is needed. David, in the end, couldn't believe both stories, right? And he chooses, as we'll see when we get to chapter 19, to just split it down the middle. In the same way, may I suggest, it's not right for us to think that if your employer fails to give you the raise, to instantly say, oh, she is unappreciative or greedy. Maybe she's struggling to keep the business going in the face of a, global pandemic. I don't know. Or, whatever else could be going wrong. We do believe in grace and truth. Truth is necessary, but we should pray for wisdom, ask questions, and not make snap judgments. The first story we hear that either someone else gives us or even we give ourselves isn't always correct. It's not always the full story. Now, if one person is trying to sneak into David's graces, another was outright attacking him. Verses 5 through 12, third one. Oops. Go on here. David's accusatorial visit that taught him humility. David's accusatorial visit that taught him humility. Verses 5 through 12. Starts off verses 5 through 8, where Shimei makes a bloody accusation against David. Verses 5 through 8. When King David came to Bahurim, there came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera, and he came out and he cursed continually. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David and all the people and all the mighty men who were on his right hand and on his left. And Shimei said as he cursed, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. Now, David is making it right now as far as Bahurim. Now, Bahurim is thought to be a site today that's about 1.5 miles from Jerusalem. in the territory of Benjamin. Has David gone very far yet? No. All right, just think about it this way. When did David hear about Absalom leaving? Chapter 15, verse 13, right? Here we are in chapter 16, verse 5, and he's gone about a mile and had all these incidents show up. We're going to see when we get to chapter 17 and 18, the actual battle is like 3 sentences long. Okay? Remember, okay, in Bible narrative, I want to help you guys remember an important thing when you're reading the Bible and the text really slows down and there's a lot about a lot happening in a very small space. What are we supposed to think? This is important, okay? Yeah. And this is what's key is here's this major battle going on. And you know what God's putting all his attention on? David's heart. The battle in David's heart is more important than the battle against Absalom's forces. That physical battle will go like this, at least in the eyes of the narrator. It's not what God cares about. But the heart battle, the lessons that David has to learn take more and more. So David arrives at Bahurim, and a man named Shimei comes out and starts throwing stones at David and his men. These could have been stones of various sizes, big stones, little stones, picked up stones. There's all kinds. Israel's a very rocky place. They pick it up, he's throwing at them. But the meaning was clear, no matter what the size was. This was a Torah-style execution of the wicked. In Leviticus chapter 20, verse 2, God commanded, anyone who gives his child to Molech shall be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. Leviticus 20, verse 2. So it's not just like we would be like, oh yeah, here's something easy to throw at you, I'm angry. No, this is like, you deserve to die. And as you can see in this picture rightly shows David is guarded on both sides by soldiers. So he's not getting pelted with the rocks, but they cannot protect him from David's words. His accusation is strong. He says, you are a man of blood. Look in verse 8. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. Now, who does he say David is guilty of the blood of? Saul. Did David murder Saul and his household? No. We talked about how the Bible makes really clear, God is making really clear, David was pulled away from the battle. He had nothing to do with it. And when he heard that someone had killed Saul and his son Jonathan, what does David do to that man? He punishes him. He kills him. But Shimei never really believed David's protests of innocence. Remember when Abner and Ishbosheth were killed, leaving way for David to become king of all people, and he blamed Joab for it? And all the nation agreed, but here's someone who's like, no, that was very convenient, David. How did that just happen that they died and you were able to take the throne? David knows he has nothing to do with Saul's death. But was David a man of blood? Yes. The chief reason David was not permitted to build the temple of Yahweh, 1 Chronicles 28:3, God said to me, you may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood. And then there's that little thing, the assassination of Uriah that he commanded, right? So that phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, is a lie. Words do hurt, especially when they hit the bullseye of truth. David is running from his son partly because of his murder of Uriah the Hittite. And so David's men take the natural conclusion and they try and have a legal response. Abishai was one of David's nephews. He, if you recall, was a great warrior alongside his brother Joab. And he knows the law says, you shall not revile God nor curse a ruler of your people. Exodus 22:28. Don't curse a ruler. This man is cursing King David. So this man, he says, is worse than a dog. Verse 9, Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head. This man is worse than a scavenger. This man is worse than a dead scavenger. And what does he want to do to the man? Kill him. Not just kill him, but cut his head off. Because I'm pretty sure science has proved that a decapitated head can no longer curse. I'm pretty sure that's the case. But remember, Abishai had previously wanted David to kill his enemy. He was in that room or in that cave with Saul when Saul had said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? Once again, David acts not based on his feelings, not based on his hurt, but he acts based on his theology. And David trusts God for judgment. There's this quiet authority and control showing true greatness as he wins the battle in his heart that is raging. Verse 10-12, the king said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, curse David, then shall say, what have you done? Why have you done so? And David said to Abishai and to all his servants, behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. Notice David gives two reasons for saying no. First off, he's resolved to humble himself under Shimei's abuse. He wants to be humbled by this. He was innocent of Shimei's charges. He had nothing to do with the death of Saul, but what he had done was actually worse. David acknowledged that Absalom trying to take the throne from him was part of God's judgment, just like Shimei was saying. But if only he knew how guilty David really was. David deserved to be cursed, and therefore he humbly submitted himself to what he knew would be God's chastisement. Now, again, reminder, who is the only authoritative voice we can trust in the Bible, or in the narrative sections like this? Can we trust the voice of every character, every person we meet? No. Only God's voice. And where is God's voice? The narrator. That's right. So David here is not speaking for God. This isn't the narrator speaking. This is David speaking when he says that God has told Shimei to do this. However, what he says matches with the rest of Scripture. The Bible clearly says that the evil Chaldeans were brought against Jerusalem, the Medes were sent against Babylon, and these nations were wicked men who could not have been moved except that God had moved them. His providence had controlled them. Wicked men are called the rod, the staff, the axe, the saw in God's hand. God wields them. Theologians describe it this way. Again, reminder, I think you guys recall this, but there are two wills of God. The first is the decretive will. Some have called this God's secret will. It's the will of what he says will happen that we don't know. It includes that here, this man, Shimei, is going to speak evil against David to humble David. But it's not right. He's lying. He's saying things that are not true, because that goes against what is called David or God's prescriptive will. These are God's commands in the law that are supposed to dictate man's conduct. This is what we should do. So secret will, decretive will says what will happen. The prescriptive will say what should happen. God uses this. Now, David then humbles himself, not just because he knows God is in control. Yeah, Jared. Both. It's different words, but they mean the same thing. Prescriptive meaning what should happen. Yeah. So that's preceptive. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Yes. Should do. Yes. We'll come back to that though. Let me come back to it. We can talk about that a little more. Let me finish this up for the sake of time. So David not just doesn't, the point being, David realizes that God's in control of this, right? God's in control, but also that he wants to use this to appeal to God for his mercy. In verse 11 through 12, he moves his audience to all his officials, not just the one man before him. So it's Abishai and all his servants, saying, "Behold, my son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today." David says, my son wants my throne. Is it any surprise I have other enemies? Right? And instead, verse 12, he entrusts himself to Yahweh. Just like Hannah at the beginning of this book, who called out to God to show kindness on her misery, David knows that God is a kind God to the repentant man who is suffering. See, this is a beautiful, theologically driven response. David's situation has changed. He's gone from being top dog to being on the run, but the Lord's covenant with David had not changed. God was still kind, and he would be kind to suffering servants. David needed a firm foundation, basically. When his world was spiraling, he went from good to bad. How does he not lose himself in his suffering? How does he make sure he wins this battle of the heart? And I love this quote from Shelby Cullen over at the Masters University. She says, "Even though people come and go, God is who he says he is. He remains constant. He's unchanging." David knew that even when everyone else had turned against him, God was compassionate to the suffering, and God would continue to be the same no matter what happens. A strong theology, knowing who God is, keeps us consistent. So let me apply this for us, because David is being rebuked. He's being cursed, and he responds to it saying, you know what? I have to learn from this. God may be gracious in this. So how should we take a rebuke? When we are rebuked, how should we respond? If someone says, you know what? You are a jerk. And here's why you're a jerk. And maybe they're being a jerk about calling you a jerk or any other kind of accusation. You're being unloving, you're being harsh, you're unkind, you're too lazy, whatever it may be. If someone says it in a bad attitude, can we just ignore it and say, oh yeah, they're just as bad as me? No. You might have the opportunity to reprove your reprover for their poor attitude, after you have examined yourself in the light of Scripture, but we must see God's sovereign use of people in our lives. So, pastor and biblical counselor Lou Priolo gives 4 right responses to criticism. The first thing we should always do is thank God. God is in control, so we should thank God for what has just come against us, because 1 Thessalonians 5:18 says, "In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you." We are to give thanks. God's doing this for a reason, even though it hurts. Trust me, it hurts. I don't like criticism either, especially when it's wrong, but God is doing it. Secondly, though, we need to ask ourselves, what is my reprover really saying to me? Proverbs 17:10 says, "A reproof enters more into a wise man than 100 stripes into a fool." Proverbs 17:10. What you don't want to be is the fool who's like, "No, I'm not going to listen to you." Whatever you like, that you hear part of it and then you shut it off. You hear their tone and you don't listen to their words. Instead, we have to look for the truth in what they're saying. Maybe it's only 10% of what they're saying is true, but look for that 10%. And then, probably the hardest thing he suggests is to thank the reprover for his reproof. This step communicates that we are receptive to the reproof, but also prepares us to actually have more communication. There's nothing that would shut down a conversation like just walking away from someone, but if you thank them for what they have said, it shows that you are not a fool. Proverbs 9:8 says, "Reprove not a scorner lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man and he will love you." Do you want to be a wise man? Then love those who rebuke you, even if they're only 10% correct. And then probably most importantly, fourth, ask yourself, what message might God be trying to get through to me? If our focus is just on the attitude of the person, if David only focused on the fact that Shimei said, "You killed Saul," then he would miss the greater picture of learning humility and reliance upon Yahweh. We have to not just focus on the attitude of the reprover, so we do not miss the truth in the reproof, because God could be doing something good with it. Now, our passage ends with David getting a restful break that give him help. He gets the help that he needs. Verse 13 and 14, David and his men went on the road, while Shimei went along on the hillside opposite him and cursed him as he went and threw stones at him and flung dust. And the king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan, and there he refreshed himself. David may accept the truth that God is in control, but that doesn't mean all the pain just goes away. Wouldn't it be great if we learned a lesson and then it's just, then it suddenly was easy? No, God doesn't bring a stop to it right away. It continues on, but they do finally make it to the Jordan. They arrive at the river that goes between. They get rest, they get comfort, and they will receive victory soon. Overall, David had 3 people appear to him to test him and grow him by God's design. From Hushai, he saw God answers his prayers. He learned once again God answers prayers. From Ziba, he will learn he needs to act on wisdom and not just on the first thing he hears. And from Shimei, he was reminded of humility and trusting God. Now, we too need to see life's circumstances as growing us. That we believe, Romans 8:28 and 29, God works all things together for the good of those who love him. For those he called, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Every single trial is being used to make us more like Jesus.